The station smelled like 17 kinds of air and 0 kinds of agreement. Ambassador Yael Oduya Marsh had spent 11 years learning to breathe in it anyway. She stood at the center of the conclave floor, a wide, circular room with curved walls that climbed 3 levels, seats packed with delegates from every recognized species in the known galaxy. Some breathed oxygen, some didn't. Some communicated through vibrations felt in the floor. One species, the Marathi, communicated mostly through silence, which made them Yael's personal favorites. The Velthara delegate was not silent. Praetor Voice Okath stood 7 feet tall, had 4 arms, and a voice like gravel poured steadily down a very long drain. He had been speaking for 40 minutes. He would, Yael suspected, speak for 40 more. The Velthara were good at many things. Brevity was not among them. She kept her face still, hands folded on the table. Posture what it always was, open, calm, present. Like a woman with nowhere else to be, and nothing in particular on her mind. 11 years. She had gotten very good at the face. Okath was talking about the Areth mining routes. Specifically, about why the Velthara-Skethian coalition deserved a larger share of them. He had made 14 arguments so far. 12 were reasonable. 1 was dishonest. 1 was a direct insult wrapped in formal language so thin you could read a document through it. Yael waited for him to finish. He finished. She said, "Thank you, Praetor Voice. Humanity's position remains that the Areth routes fall under the existing shared framework agreed upon by 11 species, including your own, 9 years ago. We are prepared to revisit the distribution model. We are not prepared to discard it entirely. We propose a revision committee." Okath looked at her, the way something large and unbothered looks at something small when it is deciding whether the small thing is worth the energy of contempt. "The humans," he said, in the common tongue, clearly, and for the whole room, "have a remarkable gift for proposing committees." A sound moved through the gallery. Not quite laughter. Not quite not. The Skethian delegate Council Vreth, 4-eyed and compact, made a noise that could have been amusement. Hard to tell with Skethians. "We find committees productive," Yael said. "You find them safe," Okath said. "Your species has been in this conclave for 190 years. In that time, you have proposed, by my count, over 4,000 committees, working groups, and revision panels. You have started 0 conflicts. You have mediated 47. You have a remarkable talent for making problems smaller without making them go away. We prefer to think of that as diplomacy. We prefer to think of it," Okath said, and his voice filled the room the way water fills a space, finding every corner, "as livestock management. Your instinct is always to back away from the fence." The room went still. Councillor Sane of the Marathi, a slight, pale woman who had been sitting in on 3 consecutive sessions, did not move. She was watching Yael. She had been watching Yael for a while now. The way someone watches a bridge they are about to cross, checking every cable, every bolt. Yael looked at Okath. She smiled. It was not a warm smile and it was not a cold one. It lived in the space between those 2 things, steady and quiet and private. The smile of someone who had been handed a very specific permission and had decided, today, not to use it. "I'll note your comments in the session record," she said. "Shall we continue?" Up in the gallery, behind the observation glass, Lieutenant Soren Adisa watched the monitor. He was 31. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away. People often made the mistake of assuming that meant there was nothing behind it. They were wrong about that. It did not bother him that they were wrong. Being underestimated was, in his experience, a useful condition. His official role was military liaison to the human diplomatic mission. His actual job was quieter and more specific. He wrote reports. He tracked figures. He maintained a file that no one outside a small, careful circle of people knew existed. He watched Okath say the word livestock. He watched Yael smile. He exhaled through his nose. Opened the file. Added 1 line. Velthara delegate formal session, direct provocation threshold. Not met. He updated the counter at the top of the document. Sibayishar. He closed the tab. Watched the floor below. Yael had already moved to the next agenda item. Resource access in the 7th corridor. She spoke with total calm, clear voice, no heat. By every visible sign, she was completely fine. Soren had learned, in 3 years working alongside her, that visible signs were not always the right measurement. He had met her at the beginning of his assignment. She had shaken his hand, looked at him a real look, the kind that takes stock and said, "You're one of the quiet ones." He hadn't known what to say. "Good," she had said, and walked away. He understood later what she meant. She was surrounded every day by people who were very skilled with words, people who filled space with language, until there was no room left for anything else. His job, the real one, was to stand at the edge of all that language as the thing the words were holding back. Not threatening, not restless, just present, like a closed door, like a number in a document that kept going up. The session ended without resolution on the arreth routes. A working group was proposed. Timeline. End of cycle. Everyone left with the face they had arrived with. Okath passed the human delegation without acknowledgement. Yael gathered her materials. She moved the way she always moved, measured, unhurried. Hurrying shows them something, she had said once. She did not show them. She passed Soren in the corridor outside. Didn't slow, didn't look at him. 4:12, she said. Yes, he said. How long before they stop being worth the effort? He thought about it for a few steps. They already aren't, he said. They don't know that yet. She made a small sound. Not quite agreement. Not quite anything. Turned a corner. Gone. Soren stood in the corridor. The station hummed around him, mechanical and constant. The sound of 17 species sharing space without sharing much else. There was a saying inside the human diplomatic corps, passed mouth to ear, never written down in any official document. Don't let them see the files. He pressed his badge to the reader. The secure door opened. He went through. Behind him, the conclave session wrapped up. Delegates filtered into corridors, into transport pods, into their separate atmospheres. The counter sat at 412. In his quarters that night, Okath opened his research files on human history. He had been reading carefully for months. He had found the old wars, the weapons, the long and brutal centuries of humans fighting each other. He had seen the casualty figures, the scale of the self-destruction. His conclusion: a species willing to nearly destroy itself is not dangerous. It is simply reckless. He closed the file. He slept well. He would not, later, count that among his better decisions. The attack came on a Tuesday. Not that the day meant anything to the Velthera-Skethian coalition. They had their own ways of marking time, their own sense of when to wait and when to move. They had decided, after careful calculation, that now was the right moment. 17 human colony worlds, all hid inside the same 6-hour window. The plan was clean. Remove the outer settlements, cut the supply lines, send a message too large to be argued into a committee, and quietly shelved. Show the galaxy that humans were exactly what everyone had always suspected: soft, flexible, capable of absorbing a blow and retreating behind new proposals. The plan assumed humans would look at the size of the message and back away from the fence. The plan was wrong from the first hour. It just took a while for the people who made it to understand that. The emergency signals came in waves. At the conclave station, Lieutenant Soren Adisa was the first to see them. He was always the first. That was the job. He sat at his desk in the secure section of the human mission offices and watched the feeds update in real time. Colony stations going quiet. Communication links dropping. Fleet transponders blinking out one after another, like someone walking through a room and turning off the lights without hurry, without drama. He did not reach for the counter file. This was not a provocation. The counter was for provocations. This was something else, a different category, one that did not have a number because it had never happened before. He sent 3 messages in 4 minutes. The first to Ambassador Yael Oduya Marsh, the second to Earth's Security Council. The third was a short sequence of numbers to a secure address he had memorized 3 years ago on his first day in this post, and had hoped, simply and genuinely hoped, he would never need to use. He sent it anyway. Then he sat and watched the feeds. Yael received the first message at 0340 station time. In her quarters. Still asleep. She was awake before she finished reading it. She dressed. She moved through the corridor without slowing to speak to anyone she passed, except to say, "Get everyone in. Now." By the time she reached the situation room, she had read the casualty estimates 3 times and stopped reading. The numbers did not change on a 4th reading. Reading them more only made the walls feel closer. 42 million people in the first 6 hours. She sat at the head of the table. She was very quiet. Her staff had learned what that particular quiet meant. It was not the quiet of a woman with nothing to say. It was the quiet of a woman doing fast and specific work inside her own mind. And the less you interrupted it, the better the outcome for everyone in the room. When she finally spoke, she said, "Get me a secure line to Earth. Priority channel. I want to speak to the council before they vote." She spoke to them for 40 minutes. She argued for a formal ultimatum first. One more message. One more door left open. She had spent 11 years finding doors to leave open. She was good at it. The council listened. They respected her. She was the best they had. They voted anyway. Unanimous. 1 abstention. Yael didn't register the abstention as a protest. She registered it as what it was, grief, wearing the only shape grief had that still fit inside a diplomatic framework. She noted it. Set it aside. There was still work to do. Earth's final diplomatic transmission went out 40 minutes after the vote, sent on every active frequency, translated into all 17 conclave languages, short enough to read in a single breath. For 190 years, you knew us as diplomats and peacemakers. We chose that. We need you to understand, it was always a choice. What follows is not diplomacy. What follows is the other side of us. We sought peace. Now you will meet the other side of humanity. We are sorry it came to this. You will be sorrier. 41 words. At the conclave station, Councillor Sane of the Marathi read it twice. She opened a new document on her tablet. She titled it, The Reckoning. She began, at the top of the first page, to write. She would keep writing for a long time. In his command chamber aboard the Velthara flagship, Praetor Voice Okath watched the transmission 3 times. He played it for his generals. One of them laughed. The sound bounced off the walls and disappeared. Okath did not laugh. He had been reading, more carefully than before. He had found older files buried in human historical archives, not often referenced, not considered important by the scholars who organized such things. The files that covered the 2 centuries before the conclave, before the diplomacy, before the smiling, and the committees, and the patient, maddening calm. He had found what they had been before all that. He had read the weapons designs, not the headlines about the weapons, the actual specifications, where those had survived. He had read accounts of the wars, not the summaries, the first-person accounts, the ones written by people who were there and had no reason to make it sound better than it was. He had read all of it, and then he had thought about Yael's smile, and the 2 things had sat next to each other in his mind and made a shape he didn't like the look of. He sent a message to High Command. 3 words. Recall the fleets. High Command did not respond that day. The next morning, his aide brought the reply. Directive declined. Operation proceeding on schedule. Praetor Voice Okath to maintain current position and await further instruction. He read it twice. He did not send another message. He was a man who understood the limits of his own authority. He had always operated within those limits. It was the foundation of his career. He sat with the old files open on his screen and looked at them for a long time. He was not someone who scared easily. He had commanded 6 campaigns. He had won all of them. He had a record that, by any fair measure, was exceptional. He sat there, in the quiet of his own chamber, and felt for the first time in a long career that exceptional was not going to be enough for what was coming. He was right. He would not live to tell anyone that. 3 weeks later, when the human fleet reached his position, Okath stood on the bridge and watched the formations take shape on the long-range display. He watched for 6 full minutes. He watched how they moved. He watched how they adjusted mid-approach, without signal, without apparent command. as if the individual ships could read each other and the battlefield at the same time. He thought about the smile. He thought, she knew. The whole time. She knew exactly what she was not doing. He gave the order to hold position. Not because he believed it would work, because he was the kind of man who held position when there was nothing else left. The battle lasted 11 minutes. His flagship's final transmission, recovered weeks later by a conclave salvage team, logged and filed, was 4 words, sent to no specific address, broadcast open on all channels in the last 30 seconds. I should have listened. Nobody answered. There was nothing to answer. The stars outside the bridge viewport didn't change. They were not interested in being dramatic about it. They just kept burning, the way they always had, the way they would long after everyone aboard that ship had stopped mattering to anything. The counter, back at the conclave station, still read 412. Soren had not updated it. He had opened the file once, the morning after the attack, and looked at the number for a long time. Then he had closed the file without adding anything. Some things didn't belong in the same document. Tessevar had been assigned to long-range observation of human space because her commanding officer considered it a quiet posting. Commander Rev had not said this directly. He hadn't needed to. The assignment came with a small station, 3 crew members, equipment 2 generations behind current standard, and a patrol radius that covered the least strategically important stretch of human territory in the sector. Quiet posting. Tessevar understood. She did not argue. She was good at her job better than Rev knew, or cared to find out, and she had learned that being very good at your job inside an organization that wasn't looking at you closely was its own kind of freedom. She set up her observation protocols on the first day. She ran them daily. She filed reports to a channel she suspected no one was actively reading. She watched. For the first 2 weeks after the attacks on the human colonies, human space looked exactly the way Rev's plan assumed it would look. Quiet. Disrupted. Damaged communication networks. Rerouted supply paths. The ordinary signature of a civilization that had taken a serious hit and was managing the wreckage. By week 3, it looked different. Not dramatically different. Not obviously different. The kind of different that announced itself. Tessevar had to look carefully, had to run comparison analysis against her baseline readings from the previous month to see it. But she saw it. The cargo freighters were changing their routes, not because the standard lanes were damaged and the lanes were functional. The freighters were going somewhere specific. She tracked 3 of them to a manufacturing cluster near the outer belt and noted that they arrived empty and left carrying something dense. Her sensors couldn't identify the cargo, but she noted the weight. She noted the destination vectors. She filed a report. No response. By week 4, the automated shipyards had come online. This was the part that made her stop and sit very still at her console for a long time. There were 7 automated shipyards in the sector she was monitoring. She had logged them in her first week, large, older structures, long dormant, their power signatures barely readable above background noise. She had cataloged them as inactive infrastructure, not relevant, not worth watching. All 7 were active now, simultaneously. Their power output had gone from near zero to full operation in a window of approximately 9 hours. She ran a diagnostic check on her own equipment, calibrated her sensors, ran it again. The readings were correct. She pulled historical records on the yards, found their operational history. They had last been active 61 years ago, in the decade before humanity joined the conclave, during what the human archives called the consolidation period. The broader galactic record didn't cover that period in much detail. Nobody had thought it was worth covering in detail. Tessevar was beginning to understand why that had been a mistake. She filed another report, flagged it urgent, recommended immediate review. No response. She kept watching. By week 6, she had identified 32 separate indicators. Freighter routes, shipyard output, communication patterns that had shifted from civilian traffic to something tighter and shorter and more structured. Industrial platforms that had changed their energy output profiles in the specific way that happened when a facility changed what it was producing. She compiled everything into a single document. 8 pages. Analysis. Projections. And at the end, a section she titled, simply, Assessment. She wrote, based on current observable data, the human civilization is in the process of converting a significant portion of its civilian industrial capacity to military function. The rate of conversion suggests this process began within 72 hours of the colony attacks. The scale is larger than this sector alone. I am extrapolating from what I can observe, but the pattern is consistent with a civilization-wide response, not a regional one. The speed of conversion suggests this was not improvised. She stopped. Read that last sentence again. The speed suggests this was not improvised. She sat with that for a while. She thought about the diplomatic history. 190 years of careful, patient, relentlessly peaceful engagement. 190 years of proposals and revisions and compromise, of humans absorbing every insult and responding with another olive branch. She thought about what it meant that a species capable of doing. She looked at her screens again. This, at this speed, at this scale, had spent 190 years writing committee proposals instead. She thought about what that choice must have felt like to make. Every day, for generations. Her species had many words for strategic thinking, for threat assessment, for calculated restraint. They did not have a word for the specific feeling of realizing you had been sitting very close to something large and quiet for a very long time, and that the quiet was not the thing's nature. It was the thing's decision. She sent her report directly to Fleet Admiral Surith. Bypassed the standard chain entirely. Included everything. Every data point. Every projection. The full assessment. She added one line at the bottom, outside the formal format, in plain language. I want to be wrong about this. I do not think I am wrong about this. The Admiral's office responded 4 days later. Thank you for your submission. Assessment noted. You are reminded that communications outside the standard reporting chain are a protocol violation. Please direct future reports through Commander Rev. She printed the reply. Looked at it. Set it face down on her console. She kept watching. By week 8, the numbers had grown beyond what her projections had modeled. She had underestimated the scale. She understood why at the bottom of every projection she had run, she had assumed a limiting factor. Some ceiling on how fast a civilian infrastructure could be converted. Some constraint on how many people could be redirected in a short time, how much knowledge could be applied quickly. She had not considered the possibility that the knowledge was already there, maintained, updated, passed down through generations inside human institutions, sitting in files and training programs, and technical specifications. Ready. Just in case. She filed one more report, not to Rev, not to Surath. She sent it to the Conclave Intelligence Office, which operated across species and answered to no single government. The report was her longest yet. She had spent 3 days writing it. She requested immediate review, immediate reassessment of coalition tactical projections. She requested, specifically, that someone with genuine authority read the complete human historical record from the 2 centuries before Conclave membership. Not the summary. The full record. She sent it. She sat back. She looked at her screens. The shipyards were running full output now. All 7. Continuous. Their power signatures pulsed on her monitor. Steady. Enormous. Patient. Her comm unit chimed. Commander Ref. Tessavar. I've received formal complaints about your communications outside the chain of command. Report to the main station when your rotation ends. We'll discuss this in a formal review. She looked at the message. She looked at her screens. She typed back. Understood, sir. She did not go. She stayed at her console and kept watching. She watched the human manufacturing output grow week by week. She watched ship classifications begin to appear on her sensors, new builds, leaving the yards, forming into groups, moving toward the border in patterns her tactical software flagged as coordinated fleet movement. She watched the fleet assemble. She had been a military intelligence officer for 14 years. She had assessed fleets before. She knew what a war fleet looked like, designed to project power, to demonstrate capability, to make the intended message clear. This was not that. What she was watching looked less like a display of strength and more like a tool being picked up by someone who had used it before. No wasted movement. No dramatic formation. just a very large number of ships, moving with the quiet efficiency of a thing being done by people who knew exactly how to do it. Her long-range sensors spiked past normal range when the first full formation crossed into the monitoring zone. She stared at the readings for a full minute, certain her equipment had finally failed after weeks of continuous use. It hadn't. She filed one last report. She had nothing new to add analytically. The numbers said everything the numbers could say. She had 3 sentences left. She wrote them. The fleet has crossed into monitoring range. My previous assessments were correct and have been consistently ignored. For the record, I told you. She sent it. She did not wait for a response. She turned back to her screens and watched what happened next, because she was, above all things, very good at her job. And what happened next was the kind of thing that, once you had watched it, you did not forget for the rest of your life. Commander Adaize Nwosu Park did not make speeches. This was something her crew had noticed in the first week, and had come, by the third week, to appreciate. The commanders in the old war stories always had speeches, long ones, full of references to home and honor and the weight of history. Nwosu Park had read those stories when she was young, and had thought, how much fuel are they burning on speeches that could be spent running simulations? She ran simulations, every night, every quiet hour. Her battle station was kept at a temperature her crew found uncomfortably cold, because she thought better in the cold, and she had stopped explaining this by the end of week 1. She had been given command of the 14th Combined Fleet, because she was, by every metric, her superiors could calculate, the best available option. She had been the best available option for 6 years. Normally that kind of record led to an administrative role, somewhere important sounding and distant from actual decisions. There was no administrative role to be promoted into right now. Every person with her skill set was pointed at one problem. She was pointed at the version of the problem that needed solving in the field. She was comfortable with that. The first engagement happened in the Terran corridor, a long stretch of empty space between the outer colonies and the first major Velthara system. The Coalition sent 240 warships. By their doctrine, this was more than sufficient for a decisive engagement against a force they had consistently assessed as limited in military experience. Nwosu Park looked at the formation on her tactical display for a long time, long enough that her second-in-command, Lieutenant Reyes, shifted in his chair. Crescent formation, she said. Standard Velthara opening. They'll compress the center and push us toward the gravity well. Yes, Reyes said. Run pattern 7. Offset by 30 degrees. Fold the left wing inward when they commit to the compression move. Pattern 7 was built for smaller engagements. Scale it. Let's see what happens. What happened was this. The coalition formation compressed its center exactly as doctrine instructed, exactly as it had successfully executed in 6 previous campaigns. The human left wing folded inward at the moment of commitment, not retreating toward the gravity well as the coalition's predictive models said it would, but folding in the opposite direction, wrapping around the exposed flank of the compression force. The Velthara center pushed forward into nothing and found itself caught on 2 sides at once. The engagement lasted 4 hours. Nwosu Park spent most of it at her station, eating a protein bar, working through a document she titled Terran Observations. When it was over, and Reyes brought the casualty report, she read it carefully, then added one more line to the document. Coalition predictive modeling assumes human forces will follow a standard retreat pattern under pressure. They have not accounted for the possibility that we don't have a standard retreat pattern. Every pattern we have was developed fighting ourselves against opponents who already knew our doctrine, so the doctrine had to keep changing. Test this assumption again in the next engagement. See if they've updated their models. They hadn't. Not by the 3rd engagement. Not by the 4th. By the 5th, they were learning. But learning slowly against an opponent who updated every single time was not a sustainable position, and the coalition commanders were beginning to understand this in the way that you understand something when the understanding arrives too late to help. What the coalition had never been told, what no one outside a small circle of human institutions had thought worth mentioning, was that humanity's centuries of internal conflict had produced a military tradition unlike anything in the known galaxy. Other species built war doctrines designed for external threats. for enemies with different technology and different thinking. Human doctrine had been forged against humans, against opponents who shared the same history, the same manuals, the same equipment, the same instincts. You cannot win against an enemy who already knows every move you know. So you have to make moves that aren't in any manual. And then when the enemy learns those, you make new ones. For 800 years that had been the condition of human warfare. The coalition walked into a galaxy's worth of accumulated adaptation and called it inexperience. Across the sector, Admiral Sovereign Vroth watched his tactical feeds with the careful attention of a man who had spent 40 years being right about things and was beginning to suspect he had been wrong about this one. He was old. He had commanded 6 campaigns. He had a record his culture held up as a model for young officers. He was not the kind of man who panicked, and he was not panicking now. He was, more precisely, recalculating. He watched the Terran engagement replay on his display. He watched the coalition formation execute exactly as trained. He watched the human wing move in the direction his tactical computer had flagged as non-standard, the word blinking in small letters at the edge of the screen, and he watched the result. He had his aide play the final 20 minutes twice. Then he asked a question he had not asked in 20 years of command. Do we have records of human fleet engagements before their conclave membership? His aide searched for several minutes. Limited records, Admiral Sovereign. The humans had very few external conflicts before joining the conclave. Their pre-conclave fleet activity was almost entirely internal. Internal, Vroth said. Civil conflicts, sir. Factional wars. Vroth looked at his display. Internal conflicts. A species that had spent the centuries before conclave membership running military operations against itself, against opponents who shared the same technology, the same training, the same instincts, who had to keep evolving, because the alternative was losing to someone who knew everything you knew. He thought about the Terran engagement. He thought about what non-standard meant. He thought, non-standard to us, routine to them, because they have been doing this to each other for centuries, against opponents who already knew the standard version. Pull the next 3 coalition engagements from the schedule, he said. I need to revise the tactical framework before we commit further forces. His aide relayed the order. 2 hours later, High Command sent revised instructions. Attack schedule maintained. No delays authorized. Vroth read the order. He followed it. He was the kind of man who followed orders. It was the foundation of everything he had built, every campaign he had won, every commendation in his file. He followed the order and sent his forces into the next engagement and wrote 1 line in his personal log when the results came back. She already knew what we were going to do. He didn't know her name yet. He would later. The whole galaxy would later. At the conclave station, Counselor Sane added a page to The Reckoning every evening. She had been writing since the day the message was sent. The document had grown past 300 pages and showed no sign of stopping. It was a record of every dismissal she had witnessed in 11 years as an observer. Every joke. Every use of the word livestock. Every session where a human proposal was not rejected on its merits but simply because it had come from humans, and humans were the ones who always bent. She had thought, when she started, that she was writing a historical document, a record of causes. By page 300, she understood what she was actually writing. She was writing a record of a choice. 190 years of a species that woke up every morning, knowing exactly what it was capable of, knowing exactly what the other option looked like, and choosing every day, every session, every insult absorbed and smiled through, to try the other way one more time. She wrote that at the top of a new page. She looked at it for a while. She thought about the cost of that. The specific, interior cost of being what you are and spending a career pretending to be something smaller. She thought about Yael's smile, the one she'd watched across the conclave floor the day Okath said the word livestock, and understood, for the first time, what kind of smile it actually was. Not patience. Not weakness. Not a woman who didn't feel what had been said to her. A woman who felt it exactly, knew exactly what she could have said back, and chose not to. Every day. For 11 years, Sane closed the document. She went to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, Nuosu Park was already running tomorrow's simulations. The war was not over, but its shape had already been decided. It had been decided, Sane thought, a long time ago, the moment a species that knew what it was, decided to be something else, and spent almost 2 centuries making that choice hold. The other choice had always been there, waiting, patient as anything. The coalition delegation arrived at the conclave station on a Thursday. There were 9 of them. They were shown to a formal meeting room, neutral space, standard protocol, the kind of room that had hosted hundreds of negotiations and had the particular stale air of a place that had absorbed many difficult conversations and given nothing back. They sat. They folded their hands. They waited. They were expecting a military commander, someone in uniform, with a record of the campaign visible in their posture, who would lay out the terms of defeat in the language that defeat was usually given formal, complete, designed to remind the people across the table exactly how far they had fallen. The door opened. Ambassador Yael Oduya Marsh walked in. She was older than the last time most of them had seen her in person. The kind of older that doesn't come from time alone, the kind that comes from carrying weight through time. She carried a plain folder. She sat at the opposite end of the table, set the folder in front of her, and folded her hands on top of it. She looked at the delegation. They looked at her. The lead delegate, Praetor Emissary Thelk, young, the 4th person appointed to his role since the war began, said, "We are prepared to discuss terms." "Good," Yael said. "So are we." She opened the folder. The terms were not what they had brought themselves to expect. No occupation. No demand for territorial rights. No reparations calculated to strip the coalition down to its foundations and leave it dependent. No language designed to humiliate, none of the ritual diminishment that most post-war agreements use to make the losing side feel the full shape of their failure. Colony rebuilding support, provided formally through conclave channels. A structured withdrawal timeline, designed to be realistic rather than punitive. A joint truth commission operated by both sides, overseen by the conclave tasked with producing a complete public record of the conflict. What happened? Why it happened. All of it. From the beginning. Thelk read through the terms twice. Carefully. The way you read something when you are looking for the part that catches. "You're not taking anything," he said. "We don't want anything you have," Yael said. "We want what was started to stop. And we want a record that says clearly what it was." The Truth Commission will record what the coalition did, yes, and what the human response was, all of it. We have no interest in a version that makes us look clean. We're interested in a version that's accurate. Our people destroyed a great deal out there. We want that in the record too. Thelk looked at her. "Why?" he said. Not a diplomatic question. A real one. From someone young enough to still ask real questions across a negotiating table. "After what was done to your colonies, why offer this?" Yael was quiet for a moment. She had given versions of this answer before. The official version was well constructed and true. Sustainable resolution, long-term stability, the importance of preserving the conclave framework that had kept most of the galaxy out of catastrophic conflict for 2 centuries. It was a good answer. She believed it. It was not the whole answer. The whole answer was longer than a formal negotiation room was the right place for. From the corner of the room where he had been standing since before the coalition delegation arrived, unremarked, still, the particular stillness that meant he was paying very close attention to everything, Lieutenant Soren Adisa said, without being asked. "Because we know what we are when we stop." 8 words. No elaboration. The room held them. Thelk looked at Soren. The long look of someone trying to read a face and finding less surface than they expected. He looked at the stillness, the quality of the quiet, the specific way Soren stood in a corner of a diplomatic room, as if he were also, somehow, the room's primary feature. "Who is he?" Thelk asked. "Military liaison," Yael said. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Thelk looked at Soren for another moment. Then he looked at the terms. "These are more reasonable than we expected," he said. The word reasonable, carrying a weight of something larger than itself. "We know," Yael said. Thelk picked up the document. looked at it again. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that was not about reading but about something else, something interior, a calculation that had nothing to do with the words on the page. He signed. The conclave reconvened in full session 6 weeks after the treaty was formalized. All 17 species, all seats filled. The same circular room, the same curved walls climbing 3 levels, the same blended air that didn't quite belong to anyone. Humanity took their seat at the table. Something in the room was different. Not a thing you could point to specifically. Not the architecture, not the seating arrangement, not the agenda documents stacked at every station. The structure of the session was the same as it had always been. What had changed was harder to locate. It was in how the conversation moved. How proposals were phrased, "We'd like to hear the human delegation's position," had replaced the polite, distant acknowledgement that had been standard for years. It was in how the other delegates arranged themselves when entering, which chairs they chose relative to the human seats. It was in the small, consistent adjustments of a room full of very intelligent species, recalibrating their understanding of something they thought they had already understood. Nobody called them the Benders. Nobody called them livestock. Okath's phrase had been formally struck from the conclave diplomatic record, per treaty terms. But it would have faded regardless. Words like that require a specific belief to survive in. The belief was gone. Councillor Sane filed The Reckoning with the Conclave, Historical Archive, 847 pages, accepted without comment by the archiving office, assigned a reference number, stored. Over the following decades, it would become one of the most accessed documents in the archive. Scholars would cite it. Officers would read it in training programs. Young diplomats from 17 species would read it and come away with the particular unsettled feeling of a lesson that has arrived too late to be useful and too clearly to be forgotten. She had added one final note on the last page, outside the formal structure of the document. Not analysis and not conclusion. Just a thing she had been thinking since the day she read the 41 words. They chose this every day. They chose it knowing exactly what the other option was. I keep wondering what that costs, from the inside. I wonder if we ever deserved the patience they gave us. I don't think we did. I think they gave it anyway, because that was who they had decided to be. I hope we are worth the decision they've made now. I am not sure we are. I think they'll try anyway. That may be the most human thing of all. She filed the document and went home. In the secure section of the human mission offices, Soren sat at his desk. He opened the file. He looked at the counter. Subai Ishir-san. The last entry dated from 3 days after the Terran engagement, the morning after the coalition forces crossed back over the border, when a Skethian diplomatic aide had sent an unofficial communication to the mission that included, buried inside a routine scheduling query, a line describing human commanders as, in direct translation, aggressively inclined. 413. That was where it had stopped. He hadn't added an entry since the war ended. He had opened the file a few times, looked at the number, closed it, without changing anything. He sat there now for a while. He thought about the day Yael had asked him in the corridor outside session 412, 2 years before any of this times, how long before they stopped being worth talking to. He had said, they already aren't. They don't know it yet. He'd meant it as a description, not a prediction. He had not known, in that corridor, exactly what was coming. He had known the shape of it. The way you know the shape of something in the dark, you can't see it, but you know where not to put your hands. He closed the file. Not deleted. Archived. Stored in the same system it had always lived in, under the same access permissions. Maintained and backed up and ready. Just in case. He turned off his monitor. He went to the window. The station turned slowly in the dark outside. The way it had always turned. The way it would keep turning long after everyone currently aboard had moved on to other things. 17 species. 17 atmospheres mixed into something that didn't smell like home to any of them. Something shared, by necessity. He stood there for a moment. He thought about Yael in that negotiation room. The folder. The terms. The way Thelk had looked at the page and understood, without anyone explaining it, what it meant that the people across the table were choosing this, after everything. Choosing it again. On purpose, with full knowledge of the other option, which was no longer theoretical. The door had always been shut. It was shut again now, and Soren was back in the corner of a room, still, quiet, watching, the number in the file, holding steady, at 413. He hoped it stayed there. He would keep the file updated either way. That was the job. That had always been the job. He stood at the window and watched the stars. And the stars, as always, did not watch back, they just burned. Patient and enormous, and completely indifferent to what small things decided to do with the dark between them. He was at peace with that. He went back to his desk and got back to work.